Hi, this is Isaac again. Thanks for checking out this week's Knowledge Bite video. Before we get started on the question, I had a funny but true story that brings to mind a point that I'd like to make during the video. A friend's father really enjoys fishing, and unfortunately for him, he was terrified of snakes and lived in an area where snakes were relatively common. So whenever he would go fishing, he brought a small handgun in his tackle box. One day when he was fishing, he was underneath some overhanging tree branches, and a snake that was resting on the branches dropped into his boat. Again, being terrified of snakes, having a gun, what did he do but pull the small gun out of his tackle box and shoot the snake? Now, the good news was he no longer had to worry about the snake, but the bad news, as you probably expected, was that he now had a rather large hole in his boat. Now it ended well. He was able to paddle to the bank before anything bad happened. But it brings to mind a lesson that as developers we need to be very careful of. And that is that when we fix a problem, that we do not cause a bigger problem or cause another problem. When we build functionality that is going to help a client, we need to make sure that that functionality is not going to be buggy or cause problems that the client will then experience. And that leads into the question for this week. It was actually a problem that I experienced just a couple weeks ago and learned a couple things from it that I would like to share. Now, before I get into it and review the question, I just would like to recommend that you head over to SwiftOtter.com. There's a lot of great resources there, a lot of opportunities to learn from some really incredible developers, the experiences that they've had. I've really benefited from the resources there. I'd like to recommend that you do the same. So now for the question. While working on a client's website, you require some additional functionality. You decide to install a third-party module via Composer that you have vetted and tested, as well as used for other clients. However, after installing the module and configuring it in the admin panel, you notice that it is not working as expected. While debugging the module, you notice a plugin on a core method and place a breakpoint at the first line of the function. The breakpoint does not trip, indicating the plugin is not running. So the question is, what is most likely the reason for the plugin being bypassed? So we have a plugin in a new module that's being completely skipped. Now the question implies that there's been some former experience with the module and that it's been vetted and tested. So as we go through the questions or the possible answers, we need to keep that in mind. So let's take a look at the answers. We have A. There is a plugin with the same name in another module, causing the plugin in the new module to be skipped. Then B. You misconfigured the module during setup, and there is a system config requirement in the plugin that is not being met, so it's causing the plugin to be skipped. Finally, C. There is another plugin, either in the core or in a custom module with a higher preference or sort order, causing an override. So the three possible options that we have. Starting at A, this is definitely a possible answer. Now you could be asking, what are the chances that there's going to be another plugin with the exact same name that could cause a problem? I agree, that could be somewhat unlikely. But that is definitely a possibility as we are installing modules working on different projects. So I'm not going to rule that one out. Moving on to B, at face value, this could definitely be the case. I've seen, as well as coded, a lot of plugins that require certain config values to work and could be skipped in the event that there's a config value that's disabled or any scenario like that. However, on the other hand, it's unlikely that there's going to be a misconfiguration of a module that's been used before. It's definitely possible, but not necessarily likely. But most importantly, the question states that the breakpoint that you placed while debugging was at the first line of the function that isn't getting tripped. So if that breakpoint is not getting tripped, it's showing that the plugin's not even getting touched. So answer B is going to be ruled out as not being correct. Now with C, the problem with C is that a plugin sort order does not affect plugins with a lower preference from running. It could change data that later plugins end up using and affect them that way, but it's not going to actually override them and cause them to be skipped. Now, in some of the comments on the question on LinkedIn, I saw a couple people reference an around plugin. And that would definitely be an argument as far as maybe being an edge case scenario here where an around plugin that doesn't call proceed could cause an override or basically bypass other plugins. But that's not going to be based off of the sort order like this answer mentions. So that being the case, I'm going to say that C is incorrect as well, which leaves us with A. Now the chances of, again, two plugins having the same name may be slim, but that would also explain the plugin in the new module being completely skipped. And what may make it a bit more confusing when you're debugging would be that you would see the plugin name that you're expecting show up in the interceptor. So that's going to give us A as the accepted answer. And for additional backstory on this question, I actually built a module a few years ago to help with some automated testing that we were implementing. I wasn't aware of a code standard that we had for the plugin names that we were supposed to be using for the SwiftOtter modules. So when I named the plugin, I didn't put any special configuration in front of the name, as I'll mention or show in just a second. So then just 2 weeks ago, I was installing a module that basically set the stage for this question. I had a plugin that wasn't working. It was completely breaking the expected functionality of the module. And when I was debugging, I actually saw the plugin name that I was expecting in the interceptor, but the breakpoint that I had placed in the plugin wasn't getting tripped. So long story short, as you would have guessed from the question and the answer, I ended up being that a plugin in the module that I built and a plugin in the new module that I was installing had the exact same name. So I ended up implementing the code standard and the problem was resolved. Again, leading us to the correct question or the correct answer being option A. Now, just to give a brief idea of the fix for the problem that I had, here's the plugin name, bypass two-factor auth, and the code standard that was implemented that I should have implemented initially being SwiftOtter _ automated testing, double colons, and then the plugin name. That would have taken care of the problem. That fixed the problem as it was. And that also brings rise to why code standards are very important. I know at sometimes they can be a little annoying maybe to remember or to implement, but they can make your code a lot easier to read, a lot easier to debug, and in some cases, they will keep you from shooting a hole in your boat. And so that's a bit of background on the Knowledge Bite question for this week, as well as an explanation on the reason I picked A as the correct answer. Again, not necessarily a common occurrence. It's definitely against the odds that you're going to have two plugins with the exact same name. But those kinds of collisions in a plugin are definitely possible, as I found out. And again, implementing code standards is very important. Again, it can be a little annoying at times, but we need to do our best to remember that, to make sure that our code, not even just for debugging later on, but for other developers, for us in a couple years, code standards can really help with the readability, maintainability, all of that. It can keep from causing problems further down the line. As developers, we need to be sure that we're writing great code that conforms to best practices, and most importantly, that doesn't affect our clients negatively further down the road. So thanks for following along in this Knowledge Bite. I hope it was helpful. Now go out, write some code, fix some problems, and most of all, make sure you don't shoot a hole in your boat.